The term the deep state is used today to denote the shadow force behind our current political situation. Many books have been written with the title, denoting some aspect of the deep state, but all of them are simply revelations that have been exposed on conservative television and radio programs concerning the cover-up of the Hillary Clinton crimes or the investigations against President Trump. They do not get into the actual deep state itself. Our book does. Now, we do not mean to disparage any of the authors of these books, and some are very good, but simply point out that they do a good job of exposing the minions of the deep state, but not the deep state itself. Our book gets into what consists of the deep state and the primary organization that ties it all together, the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, for those of you who have never been exposed to this subject before, much of what we will reveal will be hard to believe. We simply ask that you do your research on the internet. Most of this information is there. We ask that you use caution, however, because not everything on the internet is correct, or if correct, is sometimes misused to slant your opinion toward their agenda. So, let's get started. What is the deep state? Essentially, it is the organization that wields major influence to a level of control over the affairs of American society and beyond. Let us lay down a foundation for what we are going to be talking about. Many famous men in politics have stated some very important ideas and revelations about what we are talking about here. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is purported to have said in politics, "Nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way." Putting it another way, organizations count, whether it is small or large. People make things happen in politics. They are not accidents or mistakes. What type of organization are we talking about? Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1870, said this: "The governments of the present day have to deal not merely with other governments, with emperors, kings, and ministers, but also with the secret societies, which have everywhere their unscrupulous agents, and, at the last minute, can upset all the government's plans." So we see that Disraeli pointed to secret societies being a problem. Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, gets a little more specific. He said this: "From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt, who founded the secret order of the Illuminati on May 1st, 1776, to those of Karl Marx, the worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstruction of society on the basis of arrested development or envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. He claims that all of the subversive movements, such as communism, anarchism, Carbonari, etc., came out of the Illuminati." Now, Friedrich Engels, the partner of Karl Marx, tells us a little more. He stated that the communist movement was based on the extension of the French Illuminist secret societies above the rank and file of the general membership. In other words, a secret conspiracy ran the Communist Party without the rank and file, in other words, the membership, realizing it. Engels wrote about this in Social Democrat in November 1885. You can find it in the selected works of Marx and Engels published in Moscow in 1970. Many of the phrases used today were used by the communists years ago. For instance, in the book written by Marx and Engels called The Holy Family in February 1845, they used the phrase, "the New World Order." The revolutionary movement, which began in 1789 in the Cercle Social, gave rise to the communist idea, reintroduced in France after the Revolution of 1830. This is the idea of the New World Order. So we see the goal of the New World Order is not something new or an invention of the right-wing conspiracy theorists, and that it was the communist idea. By the way, the Cercle Social was run by members of the Illuminati. We have other quotes of famous men who warned us about a secret conspiracy in our book. There's several of them. What are the goals of this conspiracy? We find them in the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Engels. And quoting from that, the communists, openly declare that their ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. So we see that it is the overthrow of society. That's their aim. Marx and Engels knew that only by changing society could they be successful. For every society decides on their form of government. Change that society, and the government will change along with it. So they set down goals to change society, but they all boil down to two primary goals: a one-world government they call the New World Order, to be run by them, of course, and two, abolition of God, to be replaced by the state. They may zig and zag, but they never lose sight of these two goals. So then, the Communist Manifesto tells us they need to overthrow society. By overthrowing society or changing society, its form of government will change automatically. Now, how are the communists going to achieve the overthrow of all existing social conditions? They outline 10 primary steps in the manifesto for achieving their aims. Let's look at these 10 steps and apply them to the United States. Step 1, abolition of all private property. I'd like to ask you the question, what happens to you if you rent your property and do not pay the rent? You are evicted. What if you own your property and do not pay your taxes? What happens to you? You are evicted. Please tell me what the difference is. It shows a big deterioration in private property rights on the part of the government. Step 2, the graduated income tax. We adopted this tax 60 years after the manifesto was written. Step 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. Now this varies with each new administration. Recently it's been relaxed, but for many years it was not unusual for people to lose their estates to the government because they had too much money in the eyes of the government. It was that, or leave it to entities approved by the government, such as foundations. Step 4, confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels. This was only enforced during the Civil War. Step 5, a central bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. This is equal to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is Step 5 of the Communist Manifesto, and it was also adopted 60 years after the manifesto was written. Step 6, centralization of all means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Now today, all means of communication and transport are now regulated by the state, even to the point of whether you can even own a communications company. Step 7, extension of factories owned by the state. All land regulated according to a state plan. While we do not have factories owned by the state, we certainly have our land regulated by the county, the state, and the federal government, from zoning all the way up to what you can do with your farmland and ranch. And this is not counting all of the land owned by the government. Step 8, all must work. We are nowhere near this provision. Step 9, combining all agriculture and industry. Again, we are nowhere near this provision. But Step 10, free education in public schools, combining education with industrial production. They do not want any child to be outside of the government school system. In other words, no homeschooling, no private academies, or religious schools. This is one area where they are receiving considerable pushback from parents. In almost every one of these 10 steps, members of the Council on Foreign Relations have been involved, particularly the founding members of the CFR. There have been other steps promoted to change society after the publication of the manifesto, and they include free trade, immigration, the elimination of God in public life with the taking down of the 10 Commandments, the cross, public prayer, etc., and the deterioration of public morality, particularly the responsibility level of people to do what is right simply because it's right. So recapping, we see that secret societies have existed, of which communism is a prime example of conspiracy to change society into a one-world government to be ruled by them, utilizing several techniques to carry their agenda forward. At the beginning of the 20th century, many changes were made in the American government as a result of the dumbing down of the American students and the organizing of the international socialist movement. The Federal Reserve Bank was created, fulfilling Plank 5 of the Communist Manifesto. The direct taxation of the American people by the federal government was established. The original Constitution did not allow for the direct taxation of the people. Our founders felt that this would give too much power to the federal government over private citizens. So Amendment 16 was passed to change the Constitution and give that power to the state. Today, the IRS is used to reward or punish people based on their politics. The neutering of the United States Senate was accomplished by the 17th Amendment, where the state governments no longer appointed their representatives to the federal government, but were elected by the people. The Senate was to be the state's house as opposed to the people's house of representatives. The states created the federal government. Now the federal government started to rule over the states. One important aspect of this was that when the federal government produced a budget that contained a deficit, the state legislatures were dunned for the shortfall based on the population level of each state. This made it hard for such budgets to get passed through Congress if the senators had to come home and explain why they voted the way they did to the legislatures. It could well mean that they would not be reappointed in such a condition. The situation of the states making up the shortfall was reversed to where today the federal government helps finance the states at about 1/3 of their budgets. This is why many states will not defy the federal government in any unconstitutional laws. They've been bought off. Finally, the tremendous aid for the establishment of communist Russia by prominent men in America. The Fed was ostensibly formed to stabilize our economy and the banks. Yet, under their watch, we have had 2 market crashes, a Great Depression, and several recessions, including the Great Recession of 2008. In addition, the Fed started with $1 in circulation worth 100 cents. Today in purchase power, it is only worth 2 cents of the 1914 dollar. It's called inflation, and it's a secret means to rob the citizens of their worth. It takes 50 times the money to purchase what it took in 1914 of the same commodities. In gold, it has remained the same in weight towards the same purchases. Tells you which has value and which doesn't. Of the 7 men who founded the Fed, 2 became founders of the CFR. Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Bank and Rothschild, and Charles D. Norton of J.P. Morgan Bank. A third, Henry P. Davidson, both his sons, became members of Skull and Bones, the secret society at Yale. One became a director at Time magazine. The other became a director of personnel at the CIA. The founding of the communist government in Russia was aided greatly by the American League to Aid and Cooperate with Russia. The League's president was the head of Johns Hopkins University and a member of the CFR, Dr. Frank J. Goodnow. The first 2 vice presidents, William Boyce Thompson of the Federal Reserve of New York and Oscar S. Strauss, former Secretary of Commerce under Teddy Roosevelt, were founding members of the Council on Foreign Relations. The first meeting of the American League to Aid and Cooperate with Russia was held in the Senate office of Senator Robert L. Owen of Oklahoma, who was the sponsor of the Federal Reserve Act. 10 men who would become members of the CFR were on its board. The Wilson State Department War Trade Board recommended closer ties to Soviet Russia. 2 of the 3 board members became founders of the CFR, Thomas L. Chadbourne, multinational corporation lawyer, and John Foster Dulles, later President Dwight Eisenhower's Secretary of State. The American Red Cross played a role in consolidating communist control over Russia. William Boyce Thompson, Federal Reserve of New York, was in Russia with the Red Cross mission where he gave $1 million of his own money to the communist government. That would be the equivalent of over $40 million today. Major Alan Wardwell of the Red Cross, a founding member of the CFR, member of the secret society Scroll and Key, was vice president of the American-Russian Chamber of Commerce. During World War II, he was the head of the Russian War Relief and president of the New York Bar Association. The primary organizer of Wilson's international agenda was a man by the name of Edward Mandell House. He had written a book anonymously. He titled Philip Drew, Administrator, about an American who leads a revolution and changes America's society away from the Constitution, and then starts to invade other countries to bring them democracy. On the title page, he quotes Giuseppe Mazzini, who is a second-generation Illuminist and head of the Carbonari revolutionaries in Europe. This sent a message to those who understand what House was really all about. Trotsky, the leader in communist Russia, right under Lenin, stated that the Carbonari was the left-wing extension of the Illuminati in his autobiography, My Life. The founding of the CFR came about due to the failure of the United States Senate to ratify the Paris Peace Treaty and the League of Nations. The primary purpose was to move the support of the American people toward establishing a one-world government they call the New World Order. Founding members such as John Foster Dulles promoted the idea that treaties trumped the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, thus formulating the use of the free trade agenda toward globalism. In our book, we quote Dulles at the meeting of the Kentucky Bar Association, saying that treaties can abrogate the Bill of Rights. Just months later, Dulles was asked by Eisenhower to be his Secretary of State. The CFR became the main interlocking organization of the globalists. Most of the other globalist organizations in America, such as the Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg, Atlantic Council, Foreign Policy Association, Brookings, and many more, are led by members of the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR has working operation over the American media. Here's a chart that appears in our book that shows the linkage of the CFR and the various publications and media. It is readable in the book. We also outline in our book the CFR control over foreign policy, military, leading no-win wars, public education, free trade agreements, immigration, etc. In education, Condoleezza Rice leads the initiative for the CFR for Common Core. She is the member of the CFR, Aspen Institute, and Trilateral Commission. The program of the CFR parallels the agenda of the Communist Manifesto in that CFR members have been involved in all aspects of the Communist 10-step agenda. Here is the obituary of a very important member of the CFR, Richard N. Gardner. It garnered a half page in the New York Times, and yet most people have never heard of him. Gardner wrote an article titled The Hard Road to World Order in the CFR magazine Foreign Affairs in April of 1974. He cautioned the CFR members not to expect instant world government, but to work for the goal through an end run around sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. Gardner went on through a litany of other organizations and initiatives that could transfer power to the United Nations, such as the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organization, the Law of the Sea, or LOST, plus a variety of programs that would provide solutions to various crises and environmental concerns. This brings us to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It subordinates the United States to the UN and its covenants. The CFR is fully behind the USMCA. Its president, Richard N. Haas, tweeted that the USMCA is NAFTA plus TPP plus a few tweaks. The USMCA sets up a trade commission with complete control over our exports, imports, tariffs, financial services, etc. We will have one vote on the Free Trade Commission, as will Canada and Mexico. How will they vote based on their agreements with other countries, such as the European Union? It's got to play a role. The Free Trade Commission will operate a new environmental committee to achieve the United Nations Agenda 21-2030 objective of sustainable development, giving complete control over the American environment. Most people are not aware that there exists a North American energy integration plan. It gives complete control over our energy systems, such as oil, natural gas, nuclear, etc. Mexico in the USMCA is exempted from control over their energy systems by the USMCA. Why Mexico, but not the United States? A very revealing statement by Karl Marx exposes the free trade agenda being proposed. In a speech in Brussels in 1848, Marx said this: "Free trade breaks up old nationalities. In a word, the free trade system hastens the world revolution," unquote. Marx knew what the free trade system was all about, and we see the breakdown of nationalities and independence of countries through the mechanisms of the free trade agreements today. The Free Trade Commission will have control over future changes in the USMCA, bypassing Congress and the American people. It will also control our borders. You can argue all you want over whether we need a wall or not. The Free Trade Commission will decide who crosses our borders and in what numbers. It specifically says that we will abide by the Lost Treaty promoted by Richard Gardner. Lost has never been brought up before the Senate for ratification because it would never pass, because it places all waters surrounding the United States and our tributaries, such as the Mississippi, Columbia, Hudson, etc., under United Nations control. It also amends the Constitution without the amendment process, such as the mandate that only Congress regulate trade with foreign nations. The USMCA places all the regulation into a free trade commission. The USMCA is literally the framework for the merger of North America into one country. It's interesting that the President of Mexico, when he signed the agreement, stated it will integrate our countries. Ladies and gentlemen, integration is far different than trade. The CFR has been the primary organization behind the merging of North America into one country. They tried it through NAFTA, the Security Prosperity Partnership, and now the USMCA. They want open immigration with no borders. This is why the deep state has blocked every attempt at curtailing illegal immigration. The point man for the CFR in merging North America is General Petraeus, a member of the CFR, Atlantic Council, Bilderberg, and more. Why is the so-called free trade deal with Canada and Mexico so slanted towards merger? Simply, the American negotiator of the USMCA was Robert Lighthizer, a 20-year veteran of the CFR. Is the CFR the epicenter of the conspiracy to rule the world? No. But it is a major coordinating factor for the implementation of the goals of the conspiracy. Now, not every member is in on the game, and they only serve as dupes. The CFR comprises this deep state that influences all of American society, changing it from its founding principles to what we've seen happening in America for decades. It is not enough to expose what is happening. Who is causing it to happen is equally important. We cannot simply identify the problem as they or even the deep state. We have to expose the people involved specifically. Some people find it hard to believe in a conspiracy as we believe in it. J. Edgar Hoover, the former head of the FBI, specifically addressed this problem. He said this: "Yet the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. The American mind simply has not come to the realization of the evil which has been introduced into our midst. It rejects even the assumption that human creatures could espouse a philosophy which must ultimately destroy all that is good and decent." Now you can see in this quote why Hoover is so maligned today by the deep state. They don't want you to listen to him. Our book, In the Shadows of the Deep State, documents the full story of the CFR with information not found in other publications. Now, we've only skipped over very lightly the involvement of CFR members. The book goes into details and names scores of CFR members involved in subversion against the Constitution and the freedom of the American people. It also has a current list of the CFR members in the back. It is up to us to inform ourselves and in turn educate our family, friends, and as many people as possible as to what the deep state is. Too many refer to it without naming names. It's time to expose what and who is involved.